right, so this will be a pretty long one, and it is on the causes of the American Revolution. Generally speaking, this is all of your Chapter 6 information put into one succinct PowerPoint. So follow along and fill in your notes as we go. All right, as a review of the exploration and colonization timeline, you must remember that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, so he discovers America. In 1607, Jamestown is founded. It is the first permanent English settlement. In 1620, the Pilgrims land at Plymouth, and with that, you had the Mayflower Compact. And in 1651, the first of the Navigation Acts are passed, and these are again established and reinforce the British economic policy of mercantilism. In the 1700s, you have the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, and those lead to a lot of changes in colonial life. People using science and reason to apply it to social aspects, and also the Great Awakening causing an increase in church membership. Between 1754 and 1763, you have the French and Indian War, which is the very beginning of a lot of their discontent in the colonies, and many of the reasons for the call for independence are going to come from effects of the French and Indian War. Okay, as a review with mercantilism, again, it's the economic policy of the British Empire. Your colonies are basically just to benefit the mother country. This generates a lot of wealth for the British Empire by utilizing the colonies as a source for raw materials and also as a market for the British goods. The triangular trade was very much a part of the economic policy of mercantilism, and one of the main reasons why the British are so successful with this is because they have this triangular trade route where you have your slaves coming into the Americas to work, and then you have those raw materials brought to Britain, and then you have your manufactured goods which are sold back to America and things of that sort. Right, to enforce mercantilism, you have the Navigation Acts, and these series of laws are going to be passed by Parliament, again beginning in 1651. And they say that all shipping has to be done in English ships or ships that are made in the English colonies, that products like tobacco, wood, and sugar could only be sold to England or to its colonies. European imports to the colonies had to pass through English ports. So if you did buy something from someone else, it had to make the little pit stop into England to pay taxes. And English officials were to tax any colonial goods that were not shipped to England with that policy. Okay, all English colonies could only trade with England. Goods could only be exported to England from the colonies, and goods could only be imported to the colonies from England. These practices are going to benefit some colonies, but they're going to hurt others. In New England, it is very, very beneficial for your shipbuilders because you can only use British or British colony-made ships to use in your trade. But your southern colonies do not get fair prices on their cash crops because they are not able to shop around. They don't have a free market to say, hey, we'll sell this to France, we'll sell this to Spain, and vary your prices based on that. So it does not really benefit your southern colonies. There will be an increase in smuggling in the colonies because people are very upset with the Navigation Acts. Excuse my dogs. Mercantilism and the Navigation Acts are also going to be very, very difficult to enforce. So England adopts the policy of salutary neglect, basically purposely not enforcing the laws because there's really no way to keep the colonies obedient to England being across the Atlantic Ocean. And it also makes England look like the good guy, like, yeah, sure, we're going to let you get away with this. And it contributes a lot to the difficulty in enforcing laws after the French and Indian War when the British really need to enforce them because they need funds to pay off their debt. By the mid-1700s, the colonists had pushed west into the Ohio Valley, which is occupied by the French as well. So your conflict begins in 1754 with the French successful very early on in the war. However, William Pitt is going to utilize every resource that he possibly can to ensure that England is successful, even though it puts the country into a tremendous amount of debt. So your British are going to win the battles of Montreal and Quebec. This turns the war in the favor of the British. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ends the war, and that eliminates the French from the mainland in North America. Your colonists are going to participate in their own defense. even though they're largely discouraged by England, which contributes again to growing resentment in the colonies when the British begin passing new laws. Okay, so again, you have your maps of your pre-war boundaries in 1754 and then your post-war boundaries in 1763. Biggest thing here is that the British gain quite a bit of territory, though they are going to put in that proclamation line of 1763, which says that they can't settle, colonists, cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, so basically along this line, even though the British territory has now extended to the Mississippi River. So after the French and Indian War, the Proclamation of 1763 is passed. This is directly in response to Pontiac's Rebellion, which was a Native American uprising in a territory that was once disputed. The British believed it would be costly and dangerous for the colonists to settle in those areas where there had been Native American conflict. So this law forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Again, very difficult to enforce. It leads to a lot of resentment by colonists because there's a strong attempt by the British to uniformly govern the colonies suddenly, and you've had that policy of salutary neglect for so long. Okay, Parliament is going to pass a tax on items like sugar, molasses, and other goods shipped into the colonies. This is called the Sugar Act. It is used to help generate revenue, again, to pay for debts because of the French and Indian War. This calls for strict enforcement of the law, harsh punishment for smugglers. One of your colonial leaders, James Otis, is going to proclaim no taxation without representation is tyranny due to the colonies having no representation in Parliament. The Quartering Act will be passed in 1765, and this requires colonists to house or quarter British soldiers. Most of the soldiers were housed in New York, but honestly, how would you feel about quartering soldiers? Someone just comes, knocks on your door and says, hey, I'm moving in. You have to feed me. You have to make room. I'm taking your bed. How would you feel about that? The Stamp Act is another law that is passed in 1765, and Parliament passes this requiring all legal and commercial documents to carry a stamp. They weren't very expensive, however, it affects more people than the Sugar Act did, which mainly affected merchants, and your items that were required to have a stamp included ships' papers, wills, any licenses, newspapers, diplomas, contracts, practically everything. Many colonial leaders are going to protest this act, such as Patrick Henry, who we'll talk about very shortly. Okay, your response to the Stamp Act, again, it is going to involve more people than the Sugar Act did. So you have a Stamp Act Congress that meets in New York City in October 1765, and they draft a petition to send to the king. Another part of your responses will be boycotting British goods. You have the Sons of Liberty, formed by Samuel Adams, and this group consists of quite a few lawyers, merchants, craftspeople. They're protesting parliamentary laws in the colonies, and many of their protests are pretty violent, especially actions of tarring and feathering. Not the nicest thing in the world. Okay, the repeal of the Stamp Act, or the Declaratory Act, comes when Parliament realizes that the Stamp Act is a failure. Okay, really upset people. People are boycotting the goods, so they're not getting the tax revenue that they were hoping to. So they get rid of the Stamp Act, but then they pass this Declaratory Act, which basically says, hey, we can pass any law that we want. We can do whatever we want. So it's basically a formality. Doesn't really change anything. You just got rid of that one act just to say, hey, we can do whatever we want. The Townshend Acts are in 1767, and they're proposed by the finance minister, Charles Townshend, to, again, generate revenue in the colonies. Your parts or provisions within the Townshend Acts include suspending the New York Assembly until they abide by the Quartering Act, establishing duties on goods imported to the colonies, such as glass, paper, lead, paint, tea. It also establishes the use of writs of assistance. This will allow British officials to search homes or businesses for smuggled goods, and they don't even specifically have to say, this is what we're coming to look for. It's basically a blank search warrant. Come in your house, see if you've broken the law, and then handle it after that. Okay, so this leads to further protests by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The Boston Massacre occurs on on March 5th, 1770. 5 colonists are killed during the protest. Crispus Attucks is an African American who's the first person killed in the Boston Massacre. There's a huge debate over who actually started the event. There were colonists who were throwing snowballs. The British regulars had guns, and they say they fired the first shots. Who really knows? Ultimately, it's given the name massacre for propaganda purposes. You would think with a massacre you'd have hundreds of people killed or something of that sort, not just 5. Your committees of correspondence will be started by Samuel Adams. It's designed as a means to convey information between the colonists due to a perceived threat by the British government to the colonies. It starts in Massachusetts but later moves on to other colonies, and it's instrumental for disseminating information before the start of the Revolutionary War. The Tea Act in 1773 is going to put a tax on tea, obviously, but it is going to make money for the British East India Company, which is on the verge of bankruptcy. The Tea Act was an attempt to save the company, gave the company the right to export tea directly to the colonies without paying any taxes imposed on colonial merchants. It allows the British East India Company to undersell your American merchants. So if you're going to buy tea, you're going to buy as cheap as you possibly can, and the British East India Company is able to sell it more cheaply than a lot of your colonial merchants. Okay, with the Tea Act, the British assumed the colonists would like the act as it would lower the cost of tea, but resistance leaders argued that it is another example of taxation without representation. It led to several boycotts of tea around the colonies. Most were reasonably peaceful, and then some are going to result in some destruction. So that happens with the Boston Tea Party, which is December 16th of 1773. Members of the Sons of Liberty will be dressed as Mohawks. They are going to storm onto ships, break open the chests, throw 342 chests in the water. The British government demands repayment for the lost tea, but the Bostonians are like, yeah, right. The Intolerable or Coercive Acts will be passed after the Boston Tea Party, and the port of Boston will be closed as a result. The committees of correspondence are banned. Quartering of British troops is supposed to be allowed wherever necessary and whenever necessary. British officials that are accused of crimes would have their trials in England instead of in the colonies. And these laws are going to lead to the formation of the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in 1774, September, with the exception of Georgia. Their purpose is to address the Intolerable Acts and what course of action to take, but there is no real call for independence from Britain at this time. The First Continental Congress makes 4 major decisions. They reject a plan for a colonial union under British authority. They endorse a statement of grievances or complaints reflecting the conflicts among the delegates. The resolutions recommending that the colonists make military preparations for defense against an attack by Britain, and agree to non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumptions as means of stopping all trade with Great Britain. All right, your colonial sentiment. Many of your colonists are calling for a break from Britain. In the New England colonies, Samuel Adams, John Hancock could feel an impending war on Britain is near. Virginian Patrick Henry is going to speak to the colonial situation in March of 1775, and in that moment he gives his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Adams knew that a peace would not last, and so he's employing an extensive spy network to learn of British movements. With that, General Thomas Gage is going to also use spies to keep tabs on the colonists, and he learns of a weapons and ammunition storehouse in Concord, Massachusetts. Through the spies, Adams learns of General Gage's order to arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington and destroy the weapons in Concord. Paul Revere will be sent out on the countryside to warn of the British troop movements. That's famous Paul Revere's Ride. The war begins on the morning of April 19, 1775, when your British regular troops engage Massachusetts Minutemen, or the militia, at Lexington and Concord. It's called the Shot Heard Round the World. By the end of the day, 4,000 colonial militiamen participated in the battle. This marks the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Make sure that you take your quiz on Edmodo. Do not forget to take care of that, and we'll go over this information in class.